203 logical conclusions and miscalculations. When the ceiling panel slid aside that night, Kate's was the only face that appeared. "Where's Constance?" Renee whispered. "Down for the count," Kate replied. "Drowsiest kid I've ever met. Fell sound asleep at her desk. I couldn't wake her." "I guess you can fill her in later," Renee said doubtfully, and Sticky shook his head with a look of disapproval. "I'm so glad to see you boys," Kate said, sitting on the floor. She crossed her legs in an elaborate pretzel-like formation. The boys would have thought impossible. "I'm sick of studying. I must have gone over my notes 100 times, but none of it sticks in my head. It makes no sense. You must work harder and longer hours. That way you'll have more time to relax. You must have war to have peace." How are those logical conclusions? Please tell me. Renee gave a weary laugh. "What about it's important to protect yourself because it's impossible to protect yourself?" "Oh, yes, the hygiene lesson," Kate said disgustedly. "That one's the best. I would never have thought brushing my teeth could make me feel so hopeless." Renee cocked his head. Something about what Kate said seemed familiar, but what is it? "The stuff doesn't make a bit of sense to me either," said Sticky, "but I don't have trouble remembering it. I can help you study, Kate." "When?" Kate said, exasperated. "There's never any time." "No, I need to sit and do it myself." Okay, said Sticky meekly, his feelings obviously hurt. Kate was too preoccupied to notice. She was absently braiding her hair into complicated knots, then unbraiding it again. "I really don't get it, boys. What's the point of learning this mush?" It suddenly occurred to Renee what had struck him as familiar. "I think it's connected to the hidden messages. Remember the phrase we heard on the receiver, brush your teeth and kill the germs? That has to be related to the hygiene lesson, don't you think?" "Hey, you're right," Kate said, brightening. "And now that I think of it, on our first day here, we overheard the kids in SQ's class going on and on about the market this and the market that." "The free market drill," said Sticky. "Exactly. And market was the very first word we heard through when Mr. Benedict's receiver, remember?" Sticky nodded. Of course he remembered, but Kate only shrugged. "I'll have to take your word for it," she said. "Anyway, the classes are obviously linked to the hidden messages, so the question is how it all fits together." "The sooner we become messengers, the sooner we find out," said Renee excitedly. "We aren't messengers yet, so hold your horses," said Sticky, who was still trying to recover from his wounded feelings and a bit testy. "We've only been here a few days." "It's true," Renee sighed. "All right, let's report this to Mr. Benedict." They prepared to send the report to the mainland, only to be thwarted by the presence of Mr. Curtin on the plaza. And then, just as Mr. Curtin was finally going inside, a couple executives came out for a leisurely stroll over the Institute grounds. They seemed intent on strolling every walkway and path in sight. The night was growing late, and the children, exhausted, decided to adjourn. They couldn't very well succeed in their classes if they couldn't stay awake in them. "The report will keep," Kate said with a yawn. "And in the meantime, we'll sleep. You boys have a good night." She scurried up a rope, drew it into the ceiling after her, and disappeared. With a mixture of amusement and admiration, Renee and Sticky watched her go. Kate's method of coming and going still took some getting used to. What must it be like getting around the way she does, Sticky wondered. Renee shrugged. "Dusty, I imagine." Long after Kate had gone her dusty way, the boys had gone to bed. Renee had laid awake, calming his nerves by composing a mental letter to Miss Pernomal. He could never actually write the letter, of course. He could never send it, but it soothed Renee to think of Miss Pernomal in a setting far from this responsibility and danger, sipping her tea and correcting his Tamil grammar. He reflected upon the pleasant afternoons they'd spent walking in Oldwood Park, discussing this or that, her mother, or the aged trees in the park, or baseball, or dogs. At the times, too, when he told her about some of the savage teasing he'd got from other children, upon which Pernomal never offered any advice, which would have been useless, but only nodded and clucked her tongue, smiling sadly as if Renee and his memory were a memory. as if they shared it. Well, he supposed they did share it. Now he told her of it, and somehow this had always lightened his effect on him, even on occasion cheered him right up. Renee had just ended the letter when he heard Sticky rise and move about the room, and then, after a pause, whisper, "Renee, are you awake?" It would have been a nice way to go to sleep. Renee was feeling calm for the first time all day, but he couldn't very well thank Miss Pernoble in his letter for always being there to listen, and then turn around and not be there for Sticky. "Yes, I'm awake," he replied. "The coast is clear now." Renee looked down from his bunk. Sticky had put on his spectacles and was peering out the window. If Kate hadn't taken her flashlight, we could send the report. We should remember that for next time. We might as well get something out of a bad night's sleep. "We could flip the light switch," Renee suggested. "I suppose so," Sticky said, doubtfully with a twinge of worry in his voice. "But what if there's someone outside? I can't keep an eye out from over by the light switch. There are two of us, remember? I'll watch out the window." Sticky was casting about for his polishing cloth. "Makes me nervous," he said, finding the cloth on his desk and giving his glasses a brisk rub. "I keep thinking about the messenger's face when Jackson told him about the waiting room. The last thing I want to be suspected of something." He put his glasses on his head, sighed. "Now I wish I hadn't mentioned it, but I suppose we ought to." "We'll do it quickly and get it over with," Renee said. The light switch, unfortunately, made a sharp clicking sound when it was thrown. Sticky cringed with every click, as if he were being shocked, and by the end of the message, his trembling, sweaty fingers were slipping off the switch. At last, the message was sent. However, no one had discovered them. Peering toward the mainland shore, Renee chuckled. "They want to know what we're still doing up." Sticky felt too anxious to smile. "Anything else?" "We're doing excellent work. We must continue to be careful, and now we should really get some sleep." "They said all that?" Renee climbed down from the television. "Well, they said excellent, careful sleep." "They don't have to tell me twice," Sticky said, slipping into bed. "Especially not the careful part. My stomach's all in knots. Renee, it feels that way all the time." "I know," Renee said, climbing up into his bunk. "Same with me, but at least we know Mr. Benedict and his crew are out there watching. We're not alone, right?" "I suppose that should be encouraging," Sticky said uncertainly. "I take it you don't find it very encouraging." "No," Sticky replied, pulling his sheet up tightly under his chin. "No, ever since I first saw him, I keep imagining Mr. Curtin chasing me down, getting closer and closer. He seems a lot closer than Mr. Benedict and the others do, way off on that shore." This time, Renee said nothing. He understood too well how Sticky felt. If only he knew of something comforting to say, something to ease Sticky's anxiety, and yes, something to ease his own. He thought and he thought, and he lay awake for a long while thinking, surely there was something. But if there was, he could not think of it. Sticky's anxiety took its toll on him. He slept quite poorly, and all the next morning he had trouble staying awake. By the time Jackson's class started, his eyelids felt as heavy as anvils. It required a heroic effort, including a lot of painful pinches on the leg, to keep his eyes open and pay attention to Jackson's long, droning lecture. At last, Jackson finished, however, and despite his drowsiness, Sticky had managed to lock all the information securely in his head. The end of the lecture review would not require his attention, which meant it would require willpower instead. It would be all he could do to stay awake. He needed to occupy his mind with something. And so Sticky focused on Corliss Danton, who was back in the class this morning, looking no worse for wear. On the contrary, he seemed the exemplary student. He sat ramrod straight in his desk, listening with attention, and his messenger uniform was impeccable. In fact, his entire person shone from finger to foot. His fair skin was rosy from scrubbing. Even his fingernails seemed meticulously groomed. He looked as though he would smell like a bar of soap. Corliss obviously meant to make a good impression, Sticky thought. He wanted to appear cleansed of any past wrongdoings. Only after Corliss glanced past him toward the door a few times did Sticky realize he was not entirely recovered from his visit to the waiting room. His face was weary, even dazed as if he hadn't slept a wink, and an unmistakable remnant of misery showed in his eyes. Not for the first time, Sticky found himself wondering what sort of ordeal Corliss had gone through. Then he found that he didn't want to think about it, as it made his stomach hurt. And then he found that he was asleep. All right, we'll stop right there. Like and subscribe.